Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM Therapist trainings. The NARM Therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our interview. Erin Lewis-Gibson is a licensed mental health counselor and NARM Master Therapist located in North Carolina. She is the co-owner of NC Cutting Edge Counseling and specializes in dissociative disorders. Erin also offers consults for professionals seeking guidance on working with individuals with dissociative disorders. Erin's aim is to educate therapists on how to diagnose and treat dissociative disorders and to reduce global stigma around them. Erin has created a webinar titled Complex Trauma and DID, which will air February 29, 2024. As Erin continues guiding us on how to use NARM in clients with DID. After February 29th, the webinar can be accessed on our website. Please enjoy this conversation with Erin Lewis-Gibson. All right, I am sitting here with Erin Lewis-Gibson. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. So let's explore, what is it that you're wanting for our listeners to get out of our time together today?
I think the greatest thing that I could hope people leave with would be more information on diagnosing DID just for themselves in their clinical practice, like from a, I guess, like somewhat theoretical lens, as like I do a lot of the theoretical side of looking into researching DID. However, what I'm really aiming towards is practicality here. Like, what is the everyday clinician can be armed with this knowledge essentially to be able to better or more accurately diagnose their clients.
Cool. I am so excited to dive in. I fit that category. I'm your average therapist, just wanting some practical knowledge. So cool. I can appreciate it. First, if it's okay, can you just tell us a little bit about your work in the field of complex trauma?
Oh, sure. So I have been working in the healthcare field for a long while. I want to say I'm weird with time, right? Because I have DID,
Okay.
but I'm like, okay, how long has this been? I was like, oh, it's over a decade. That's a lot longer than I thought.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what I've done in the field currently with complex trauma that's been my main focus is PTSD. And then it was CPTSD, right, is the main focus. And then I went into more of somatic therapy and attachment trauma. And then I landed with IFS, and then I landed with NARM. And at this time, what I'm doing is currently getting my PhD focusing in trauma and crisis with counselor education specifically, more on that focusing on DID and pretty much examining the countertransference and the transference that's happening in these sessions between the clinician and the DID client. So that's pretty much what I'm doing now currently. I also run a private therapy practice, NC Cutting Edge Counseling. You can look up more info on our website. We're based out of North Carolina, and my business partner and I, Natalie Struck, we have built this business specifically to help folks with DID because there really aren't a lot of resources. If you look around, there's not a lot of groups. So we also do a DID group as well that is free of charge for folks. Also because we're creating treatment models to roll out to on a community level for DID. And also we're creating a course training class right now.
Okay, you are busy.
I have a lot.
Got a lot going on. We're excited about what you're bringing to the space. And also just a quick shout out, you've got a webinar coming up, which we'll talk about at the end, but just sort of a heads up for folks. If this is an area of interest for you, Erin's going to be providing a webinar coming up soon. So we'll talk about that at the end. So that's kind of just a snapshot of what you've done over the last decade and what you're doing now. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to this work?
I think it's like struggling with the authentic answer and then struggling with the answer that you think is societally appropriate. And the authentic answer is for sure like spiritual, like God. It feels like I feel compelled to be in this area. I can tell you that I specifically set out not to be in this area. I specifically set out to do anything, and I mean absolutely anything, but treating DID specifically. And then even like I was really against being a counselor for a long time too. So I completely like did a 180 on that. And I feel very compelled and called for this area of the area not just being on like treating the DID client, but more on educating the clinician on the clinician side, just because there's such a disservice that's happening. And I've also fallen in as that clinician that has like misdiagnosed people and missed like that diagnosis of DID, which has then caused repercussions for the client, right? Like without the correct diagnosis. So I feel very called in a way of educating, like filling the gap between the research and the clinician, I think specifically.
Cool. I love that so much. It's a personal thing for you. And the fact that you, I don't know, did you use the word resist?
Yes.
You tried to avoid, for a long time, and you've landed in doing this work. So really important.
Yeah. One of my supervisors, I've had a few over my time, and one of them was just like, you get a lot of weird clients. And I was just like, oh, yes, they can be strange at times, right? Like, but then I was like, I do get a lot of these types of clients and no one knows what's going on. And then that's when I started specializing in DID, because then I realized it was DID and I was like, oh, I didn't learn about this in grad school at all.
No. Okay, so let's dig into the meat of this, because I'm jumping at the bit here. Tell us, what are some of the unique, and you mentioned you have a really varied background. So you've got IFS, you came to NARM. What are the unique contributions that the models that you use bring to working with DID?
I believe a unique contribution that NARM brings where no other modality that I have personally sat in is bringing currently is a focus on the clinician as well as the client. I think a lot of modalities, like DBT, for instance, right? Like I love DBT. I send lots of my clients to DBT skills groups, right? However, it's really focused on, okay, this client is needing these skills. DBT is not focused on the relationship between the therapist and the client. And then you get into these other therapy theories that are better at that, like addressing that. But then there's still a lack of talking about the countertransference that will happen. And I do believe that that is a hindrance to people with DID getting the treatment that they do need. Because working with somebody with DID, we all have those clients that trigger us, or some of their issues can really like hit a button and we collude with their strategies, as NARM would say, right? Like, in talking about that collusion in a non-shame based way, I think is something that clinicians need to hear. Like they need to sit in. I think a lot of clinicians have that imposter syndrome or have that pressure as if they're responsible for the client's complete treatment and they're responsible if the client meets their goals. And all of a sudden, all this pressure is put on the therapist. And now if you compound that with not knowing about dissociative disorders and not having that information, all of a sudden the therapist finds themselves in this very overwhelming space with these clients. And then that leads to frustration, it leads to burnout, and it leads to like not wanting to take on clients such as this. And I think that NARM directly is addressing that countertransference, that 50-50 balance, as Brad teaches. So I think that uniquely to NARM, all of those things, yes. And the consent piece, I think, is maybe the largest positive influence that NARM can bring to the client partially, and also the piece on agency. But like focusing on that consent piece for just a second, like NARM is really great at that. Other modalities actually can harm people with DID because of the consent piece. And I've had multiple. It's pretty common to have people with DID who have been hurt by therapists and who also have been hurt by specific modalities, like common eating disorder modalities or substance use specifically. Both of those can have dramatically negative effects on a DID system. Like if you're quote unquote fighting an addiction voice, for instance, but it's actually not the addiction voice, it's a personality, like it's a whole consciousness. All of the sudden, now you're completely invalidating that part of yourself and also causing harm between like the relationship internally. We work on like the internal relations, right? Like of a system. So that relational aspect of NARM with consent, I think, is paramount actually to treating DID.
Okay, so you illustrated just briefly there one aspect of like how, for instance, with eating disorders, how it can be harmful if there isn't consent. What would the converse of that be?
So in terms of consent, if I get your question correctly, like what's it's like so in a NARM way, right? Like what's on the other side of like not having this consent. So I've had multiple clients come to me after, so just to give the listener some information about DID, the diagnostic accuracy for DID is very low in terms of it takes, some studies say 7 years. Most studies sit around 10 to 13 years it takes to get a proper diagnosis of DID. So this is a client, imagine going to therapy like insistently, right? Like, because you need therapy. This is not a want as much as this is a need. 70%, actually over 70% of people with DID have serious suicide attempts and have had a serious suicide attempt. So that's 70%, right? Like, so these folks are coming very desperate, like, hey, I need help. Please help me. And the therapist is almost always good intentioned, honestly. And okay, yes, I'll help you. Now think 7 to 13 years of not having the right diagnosis, not understanding why your behaviors are doing what they're doing, and also feeling like you are out of control and have no agency, right? Like, let's say this person has an eating disorder, right? Like comorbidities with DID are frequent, like depression, anxiety, of course, and then you have your substance use, that is very common. You have sex addiction, that can be very common. Eating disorder, substance use is like probably the primary ones that I see. However, when you look into substance use treatment and eating disorder treatment specifically, I think that they're very similar in terms of the theories that are behind modalities. So if you're like literally this client coming in desperate has most likely and probably had a serious suicide attempt in their past. They're not getting the right treatment. And now they're being invalidated by saying like, hey, I'm trying to understand what's happening before you use. Okay, but what if that consciousness isn't the one that's using? So now all of a sudden they feel like they're being gaslit, right? Like by the therapist. And then there's a spiral of shame and avoidance going on underlying anyways, right? Like, so when you're looking at this, and then you see these clients, like, I guess I see these clients is what I should say, come into my office. One just broke my heart, honestly, which was like 25 years they didn't have the correct diagnosis. And they were extremely medicated on antipsychotics when they came to me. They were unable to work. They had no social life at all. They were agoraphobic. They weren't leaving their house. And they thought it was all their fault. Okay, now fast forward 2 years of the correct diagnosis and the correct treatment. This person now owns a business, has friends and goes out regularly, is not on medication any longer, right? Like, and leaves their house substantially more, right? Like, not all the time, I will say, right? Like, it's not perfect, right? Like, but I think clinicians need to start looking at quality of life as well as like the correct diagnosis needs to happen before that quality of life conversation. Does that?
It does. And I'm just realizing I probably should have started with, can you just talk about what DID is? So talk to us about what is DID?
Right. Okay. So DID, dissociative identity disorder, has been in the DSM since forever, really. If you look back historically speaking, right, like it was called multiple personalities, and before that, it's called something else, and over and over and over and over again. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder. What this is when a client has experienced extreme trauma in their, not their attachment years, right? Like, but in young childhood. Usually it is chronic sexual abuse. It doesn't have to be, but almost always that is present with these
Mm.
individuals specifically. So you have a person who's gone through a lot of trauma, and so much so that their brain can't, like, not a won't, but can't, like, could not have handled it at that age. So then what you see is the consciousness starts to split. So we talk about splits in NARM. They talk about splits in IFS. They talk about splits in psychoanalysis. They talk about splits everywhere, right? Like, essentially, we all have splits. Somebody with DID just has more deep, very, very canyonous splits, let's call it. And that creates this, to use an Ericksonian definition of personality, I think that that would be important to say to the listeners, is how I'm viewing personality is across space and time. Do we see like similar characteristics and experiences like across space, time, and place, right? Like, so what you see with somebody who has DID is they might act very, very differently from one instance to the next. And
Mm.
this isn't just like, oh, I have a work self and a home self. This is literally, there's a consciousness that uses the brain and neural networks in a different way than a different consciousness does. And in between those spaces is amnesia, right? Like,
Mm.
so there's always the presence of amnesia with DID as well. There's other dissociative disorders that can have some amnesia, right? Like dissociative amnesia, for instance, right? Like you have amnesia, but
Mm-hmm.
DID, think of all the dissociative disorders wrapped into one. Like there's depersonalization, derealization in there as well, like feeling like you're not a person, like things aren't real outside of you. But it is like at the core, DID is this disorder of hiding where you don't want people to see you and you desperately want people to see you and to care and to notice. And yet, like, you have built completely different personalities. Like, your brain could not have handled the traumatic instances and events that have happened. So the brain literally starts to function differently. All of the research shows, like, the insula cortex, the prefrontal cortex, we're looking at the amygdala, the hippocampus. There are so many parts of the brain that are different. There's more white matter in a brain with DID. Like there are structural differences in these brains because of how trauma interacts, right? Like, so this brain wouldn't be like this without this trauma,
Mm-hmm.
for instance.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So I'm glad that you talked about that because it is like an injury to the brain, yeah? I mean, the trauma
Mhm.
has created these differences in the brain and we could say it's essentially an injury. Is that right to say that, or is that feel kind of
I would say adaptation.
adaptation? Okay. That's a better way to say it.
Yeah, there's definitely an adaptation. So there's this HPA axis, right? Like that's like going around and around in somebody's mind with DID. And that's just saying like the threat response is so high and so generalized. Like there's so many threats, right? Like a
Yeah.
common trope of folks with DID is they mistrust people to almost a delusional level.
Mhm.
It's almost delusional because, like, right, there's a difference between psychosis and DID, for instance. Like, so talking about the correct diagnosis for a moment and how to diagnose DID, there are common pitfalls. And I just want to come out to the listeners here and say, like, hey, we've all misdiagnosed DID. And while that can cause and does cause harm, I think that we need to have compassion around this. We are not trained. Like, I know for a fact that people are not trained in grad school on
Mhm.
DID. A lot of the training you get as a therapist, even for depression and anxiety and PTSD and treating these things, you get on the actual field site, like an internship a little bit. And then after you've graduated and you're like this green therapist out in the world, you have to go to extra trainings just to be able to treat. You know what I mean? Like you
Mhm.
get a lot of the theoretical background in grad school, but not a lot of the practical, like interventions. What do you do here? What do you do here? Right? Like that comes from experience. So I do want to come with a very compassionate lens to folks. I know therapists are largely attunement styled, right? Like for me to sit here and say like, hey, it's likely you've caused harm by misattuning to somebody is is likely going to cause some people distress. And I'm sitting here saying like, hey, I have DID and I've misdiagnosed this before. When I say misdiagnosis, I mean like I've missed it completely. Like completely. When I do diagnose DID, it does take me a little bit of time sometimes. I really like to make sure it's not some diagnosis that I'm like willy-nilly about, so to speak.
Thrown out there.
Yeah. Not that any diagnosis should be treated as such, but just giving a little compassion to everybody listening. Okay. So essentially, when you're diagnosing somebody with DID and you're really unfamiliar with it, I would recommend using a more structured approach to diagnosis. And for our more seasoned clinicians out there that are like, yeah, I see DID everywhere, it's like, cool. Like maybe using a more non-structured approach works best for you. I don't think that there's a gold standard. I know that in the field, like people think that there are gold standards. From my perspective, it's really how the clinician's brain works. Like what works best for your diagnostic abilities for this client, right? Like, so you have the MID, you have things like the dissociative disorders interview schedule, and you have the MFAS, the SEERS-2 to pull out the people who are malingering or have factitious disorder and actually don't have DID. There are other, like the dissociative experiencing 2 scale. There are all these scales and things, whichever works best for you. That's what I say. Like if you use the DES-2, you can't just diagnose DID based. Like it's not going to, when you tally up the score, it's going to suggest a diagnosis. Maybe, right? Like if it falls within a range, but really this comes down to the clinical gut, so to speak, which is like, what do you think is really happening here? And I think that's why NARM is so lovely to use with folks who have DID from the clinician standpoint, because you're sitting with your 50-50, right? Like, so you're not trying to put anything onto this client. You're just taking what is there. You're loosely believing, let's say, right? Like, because you're not fully bought in and you're not fully like rejecting of this information. I think keeping that 50-50 is really important, especially because the people who are malingering DID, which can be as much as 24% in clinical populations, the research is stating now. Wow. So like if you think about 1/4-ish of higher level of care DID is malingered, like now all of a sudden this adds a complexity on top of diagnosing something that's already complex to diagnose, on top of not having the information in grad school and in the public community, right? Like, so DID is prevalent around 1 to 3% of the population. So let's say 1.5% in between those two. That is the exact same statistic of bulimia, right? Like, but a lot more people understand how to treat eating disorders, for instance, than dissociative disorders, even though they're the same prevalence. Actually, DID has a higher prevalence than anorexia.
Whoa.
Yeah. So when you look at this, it's like, it's not just getting missed a little.
A lot.
It's a lot. Like it's a lot at the higher levels of care. And then when you look at the 70%, like a serious suicide attempt, and they're reaching out for help, like, and it's so hard to get them help when they are reaching out because of all of the complexities I've just listed. And then you add on top of that, like there's a stigma with DID in the actual field where people think it doesn't exist sometimes, which is like prideful, let's say, because it's, I don't know how you can say that when it's been in the DSM and we have anatomical, structural, neurobiological evidence for it. Like this is not just like, oh, clinicians are noticing this thing that's happening, right? Like we have so much evidence. So I think it's really hard for clinicians sometimes to sit in spaces that are so heavily traumatized. It puts into reality like the scariness that the world can be. And like this goes back all the way to Freud, honestly, where, he has Anna O and he's like, oh, sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse can't be that prevalent. Like, let me walk this study back, right? Like, because he got laughed at by his
Mhm.
community and he was such a
Mhm.
big deal, right? Like he's still a
Mhm.
big deal, right? But he had to walk it back because of the repercussions of other people, like in their
Mhm.
stigma towards this. So when you look at somebody with DID, you're looking at somebody that has a history of some of the worst things that you can imagine happening, and they're in your city or town, right? Like if they're in your therapy office, I do therapy like a town over, right? Like I
Mhm.
follow that
Yeah.
practice. That's really close to home. And then all of a sudden, you look at these statistics of the United States, and we are the highest in the world for sex trafficking children is the United States. Like no one's talking about it. If you look at the rates of pedophilia, it's like 5% or something like
Yeah.
that, the prevalence.
Mhm.
So when you look at all of these statistics that are like, no, 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 the world is actually very dangerous. And you have some clinicians that like all of the complex factors that I listed earlier, right? Like the lack of educational resources around DID, not being trained in grad school, all this, right? Like you put all these confounding, and then the clinician also has to face like, hey, like let's say you're a parent that's treating
Mhm.
somebody and now you're seeing like this story that reminds you of something that happens in your family or
Mhm.
something. And but you're seeing the darker side of it, right? Like now you're faced with your own not just mortality, but
Right.
also like the safety
Mhm.
issues and also with your kids.
Yeah. And I just think how, it's human nature. We want to like protect ourselves from these like big bad possibilities. So it could be really easy to sort of stick our heads in the sand like, no, 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 that doesn't happen as frequently as they're saying. This couldn't happen in my family. And it's sort of, I can see how it would be sort of protective. And our lack of knowledge or full understanding of how common it is, that's tough.
It's yes. So if you I encourage all of the listeners to go and Google, is DID fake? Okay.
Mm,
And you're going to see some people with PhDs, like literally they have their PhDs in psychology, and they're going to be like, yes, it's fake. And this is why. You have people devoting their whole careers to saying, like, no, this doesn't
like
happen. Like the
debunking it.
denial is thick, right? Like, and what it comes down to is denying that these really horrible things can happen so close to home, and they can happen to your loved ones. They could have happened to you, right? Like all of a sudden it becomes very personal treating
Mm,
somebody with DID. And if it's not personal with one personality, right? Like, or alter or part, you want to use like the word that the person is using,
okay.
honestly, or ego state. There's 1,000 different words, 1,000 different theories, right? Like all of those mean the same thing. Like this part of consciousness might be, you might collude with one consciousness strategy, right? Like, and then another part comes in and you might collude with their strategies in a different way, or you might be triggered. And then there might be a part of a person that you're treating that you're like, oh, this is lovely. Like, this is really nice.
Mm,
So then it can feel very confusing, like whiplash almost.
mhm.
Then sometimes the diagnosis of BPD is given
Yeah.
because they're like, oh, all of these unsettled emotions and like the dysregulation.
Yeah.
However, when you look at DID and you're diagnosing, this is the presence of two or more personalities and also the presence of amnesia. You don't have to see a switch anymore. That was DSM-4 criteria, DSM-5 criteria. They widened the DID diagnosis actually to incorporate, there used to be to incorporate the 1As, essentially is what I call them, because there used to be OSDD, otherwise specified dissociative disorder 1A, and then there used to be OSDD 2B or 1B. It doesn't matter. It doesn't
'Cause it
exist
doesn't exist
anymore.
anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't
They
exist anymore. I'm
wiped
like,
that
this is
out.
just,
So they
I was
don't
like,
differentiate anymore.
no.
Okay.
They widened the DID diagnosis because like to fit more people in, because then the treatment was the same for the
Yeah.
1As, right? Like, so it's like, okay, well, if the treatment's the same and
Okay.
there is amnesia, they are taking over the body. It's just like there's a difference between implicit systems and explicit systems. This is not in the DSM-5. So if you're looking for like, oh, subtype, implicit system, that's not a thing that you're going to find in
Okay.
the DSM. What I mean by implicit or explicit system is you either see the personalities come out. It's like, hey, my name is so and so, whatever. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like they're more readily in the front interacting. And then you have more internal managers types that are more implicit, where it's Like you're not sure who's out, but you know that there's been a change in affect. There's been a change in motivation. So those dramatic switches, like those shifts, it's just more implicit and it's harder to see.
Yeah.
So those folks are also like into the DID diagnosis as well. It makes sense. The treatment is the same. And they do have microamnesia. You could forget years. You could forget seconds, right? Like in your daily life. Usually it's years when you think about childhood. There's a period of time that's pretty blocked out. But if your client's also like, yeah, I'm really bad with time and I have all these diagnoses and nothing works and these treatment modalities aren't working and it's been years and years and years and they're still at just as high of an acuity. Okay, like we need to reassess what is the diagnosis here.
Okay.
A common misdiagnosis for DID or BPD, a lot of times it's bipolar, like bipolar with psychotic features, because a lot of prescribing physicians believe that DID can fall under the psychotic realm, which it doesn't at all. It falls under dissociative disorders, right? Actually, like this directly runs into why I wanted to re-record this podcast. So for the listeners, this is the second time around, but there are these things in the community, the DID community, that I think leads clinicians to misdiagnosing DID all of the time. And they're called fictives. This is not in research, though. They're just starting to research like these TikTok trends with DID. Fictives is a term used for personalities that are based off of a fictional character. So remember that derealization, depersonalization? I said, like, yeah, that's a part of DID. Okay, well, essentially, when you take that depersonalization, like, oh, I'm not a person, I don't feel like a person, I feel like more of an object or a character. All of a sudden, like, there's a whole consciousness that is now being built. It's not being built externally, it is an internal process. I think that's what I want people to hear right now. Like, when the consciousness is splitting, you have this depersonalization, right? Like, and then you also have derealization, which is like, the world isn't how I think it is, right? Like, because it's too hard to comprehend what's actually happening. So that's not actually happening. That's not real. Oh, okay, but I'm not a person either. Oh, okay. So maybe I'm like this character in this video game, right? Like, and then you have these consciousness kind of like when you're in middle school, you're like, oh, I'm a jock, or oh, I'm part of like the emo kid club, right? Like it's you're trying to find where you fit in the world. So then you have these parts or ego states, personalities, whatever you want to call them, neural networks called fictives, right? Like who really think sometimes that they're a character out of a video game. Now, that sounds completely delusional. Like it really does when you're sitting across the chair and you don't know anything about DID. That does sound delusional. And if somebody is coming to you being like, hey, I have Mario in my system, like Mario and Luigi, right? Like, and all he's saying, it's me, Mario, right? And he really, like, this person really believes that Mario is in their system. That is delusional, right? Like, we can all agree Mario's not in your system. Mario's a video game. Okay, what you see over time, though, and how you can also tell that this is DID and not psychosis, right? Like, is antipsychotics don't take away personalities, they don't take away ego states. So if they're like, oh, I'm on whatever antipsychotic, okay, like Seroquel, I hear that one a lot. Like, okay, so I'm on Seroquel. All right, well, that's not taking away any of these personalities. Okay, well, Mario's still there. Okay, you up the dosage, Mario's still there. It's like, well, it's not psychosis, right?
It's
like,
not psychosis.
However, when you go through treatment of that part, right, like of this whole system, really, the person, you want to treat them holistically, but you start to see over time, like, oh, wait, maybe they're not Mario. Oh, maybe you are a person, right? Like, and then all of a sudden you see this switch from, I don't mean switch as in transition of personality. I mean like an adjustment between like, oh, I'm not a person who's a character. I'm actually like a person who is me. All of a sudden, there's this agency that has been intact when you really identify that somebody is a person and not an object. But in the TikTok online spheres, they're calling this phenomenon fictives, right? Like now you have to take into consideration the malingering rate here because people are faking DID quite a lot. We see that at my practice often because we specialize in DID. So in the community, when somebody's like, oh, this client might have DID, they send them to us for an assessment, which I would agree with. Like, if you're not used to treating DID, you don't know a lot about it, it's unlikely that you're going to properly diagnose it without some consultation, is the truth here. So reaching out for consultations is really important. Anyways, like, when you take the online versions of what people think are DID, you start to see that, oh, wait, this is actually not real, right? Like, this is fake. This is not a thing with DID, but people think it is, right? Like, where it's like, oh, overnight, all of a sudden I had 50 fictives pop up and I have a zoo of people in here. And it's like, that's not true. It's literally not true. So for those folks that you think might be malingering, I would give the MFAS, the SEERS-2, the MMPI. Any of those can be really, really helpful. The MFAS is probably my favorite of the malingering ones, but there is a new proposed diagnosis by a medical school, actually, I was just reading about, and it's called social media associated abnormal illness behavior. That, or it's like Munchausen's by internet. They're really like going between some names right now. Social media associated abnormal illness behavior is the term that they're trying to like substantiate to use for people who really are starting to believe that they have DID, but they actually don't. And it's because of like the online spheres, right? So with that being said, I do not recommend, when you're looking for resources for your clients and they're like, oh, I just feel so alone, I have DID, there's not a lot of resources. Like, yeah, there's not a lot of resources, correct. Like, you can validate that. That is justified. That is true. And I would not recommend them go online, especially to like Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, any of those. Like, they are not reputable ways for your client to get information. The levels of malingering are much, much higher in those spaces. The research is also showing malingering is higher among people in support groups even. So for the support group that I run now, like we actually are doing assessments and things for malingerers to get them out of the groups, because when you put somebody who's malingering with DID next to somebody who has DID, there is a lot of conflict, let's just say.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not good for anyone there, you know?
Yeah. For folks who might not be familiar with what malingering means, can you share?
So malingering is when someone is pretending to have an ailment or illness, or exaggerating, grossly exaggerating or largely exaggerating symptoms, and then they get some kind of gain. So whether it's malingering or fictitious disorder, like, that's really based on the motivation of the person. I don't diagnose malingering or fictitious disorder. I just I do the assessments when it's like, oh, they are malingering, right? Like, I'll be like, you do not have a dissociative disorder. But also, I really respect psychologists in this way of like doing full blown, like, I do assessments for dissociative disorders specifically. I am not an expert and specialist in depression, for instance, or substance use or eating disorders, right? Like, so when I get a malingering outcome from these assessments, I'm like, okay, they need more assessment, essentially, like, that is broader. Like, a psychologist is going to be able to give like a more broad assessment than I'm going to be able to give, right? Like, because I'm very specialized to this. And I really do stick to the scope of like PTSD, like trauma and dissociative disorders. I really stick to that. But malingering is when people are faking an illness and they get something from it.
Okay. So to come back to this piece of, if folks are like, there's just not any resources, do not send them to the internet.
Don't say exactly.
Instead, send them.
Send them to our website. Well, like, okay, so Shepherd Pratt, they're great. McLean Hospital, they're great. Wonderful, lovely. There are some places in like Norway that Norway's coming out with a lot of DID research, actually. I'm like very surprised. I'm watching you, Norway. I see you. And also, I do want to say that there are entire countries, because I do treat outside of the United States as well, where I can. And there are entire countries that they don't have DID resources at all. There are no clinicians that treat it. And I mean none in the entire country. And when you do send somebody, I have had this experience, unfortunately, some countries will institutionalize these folks because they think that they are psychotic and a danger to society when that is not true. So in the United States, it's more of like okay, we're missing this diagnosis all of the time. It's like, it's wild how often. In other countries, it's more like, oh, we're going to lock you away and take away your rights because we think that you have psychosis and are a danger to society. And that doesn't make sense. And we can't really we can't really see how you would be a benefit to us in a society.
Oh, wow.
So as unfortunate as that is, there are some countries that really don't have resources. And I think that that is challenging on clinicians to sit with, because when you're sitting with somebody and you know that they don't have the resources and then you know that they can't get the resources, all of the sudden, this westernized model of like treatment should make people perfect. That's what it feels like to me sometimes. It's like, well, let's make this go away. And with DID, I think when somebody is diagnosing DID, getting the right diagnosis, if you're like, okay, hey, there's something off about this client, I don't know what it is, and they're having a lot of these flags of DID, either you reaching out for consultations with someone like me, or, like there's an Infinite Mind. There are other institutions and organizations with these resources that can help and aid this diagnosis, right? Like once you have the diagnosis and the clinician's like, cool, well, I have the diagnosis, now what, right? Like I live in this rural community or in this country where there aren't any resources. And that is likely. Most clinicians listening to this, that is very likely, unless you live next to like McLean or like my practice, for instance, in North Carolina. There are not a lot of resources. So just as the clinician, again, NARM is really great here to not pressure yourself to be everything for these clients. Like you can't. You just can't. We need that to pass though, and focusing on that quality of life instead of focusing on like fusion. Let's get rid of the DID, right? Like it's like, okay, well, people fall out of fusion all the time. When I say fusion, I mean like that's the final, quote unquote, final integration of all of personalities into oneness. But you fall out of fusion, right? Like that's why I'm like, I don't really like the term fusion. However, like integration is not the outcome necessarily either. So NARM is really great about taking what is in your moment right now in your life and how do you want to make your life better now, instead of like, oh, in 15 years when you've been in treatment.
Yeah.
Right? Like
that just sounds
misguided at best. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. So it's on the clinician end, I just want to caution with compassion, because I think that almost every clinician I've ran into has missed a DID diagnosis and it has harmfully impacted a client. Because if you're missing the diagnosis, think of like 10 years of not knowing what is going on with you. That is harmful, or 25 years in some clients that I've run into. But I think really like you're the resource for these people. And I think that that can be really scary when you're like, oh, I want you to find resources. And it's like, but there is none. Okay. And then you're sitting with that. It's like, oh, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
But DID treatment is like twice a week recommended. Like that is like the average recommendation of how often you should see somebody with DID. It's not once a week. It's not every other week. It's twice a week or more. I see some people 3 or 4 times a week. Actually, it depends where they're at in their trauma. Because once you start uncovering some of the trauma, right? Like, and then you have more symptoms and suicidality kicks up. So community is really helpful for these folks. And it's really hard to find that right now. And I realize that I've said that like 5 times, but I haven't given you, but here is the solution. It's like, no, I'm working towards that solution. And we don't have it, is the honest truth today. Like we just don't. Like you see a lot of these programs for eating disorder support groups or IOPs or PHPs or substance use, right? Like there's a million substance use places everywhere you go. Substance use places are everywhere in treatment. And yet with like a 1.5% average, like prevalence in the United States of DID, there are usually no support groups. There are no treatment centers that are focused on it, right? Like,
yeah,
outside of like Shepherd Pratt, McLean, Sonare today will also treat DID. There are some other places, but a lot of folks, once you actually diagnose DID, they actually won't take them anymore into, like, if they need a higher level of care, they'll say no.
Oh,
So we have barriers to treatment on every single level, on the community level, all the way through like residential care. Like there are issues, right? And when you look at inpatient levels of care, then there are also issues because they're being prescribed these antipsychotics that are unhelpful to them. So this is a complicated problem. And
yeah.
I
It's
just want
complex.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's layered. We got hindrances, but this podcast I think is really great in the way of educating people on trauma and not just being trauma informed. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, trauma does affect people, but really being specialized in trauma, I think is going to be necessary for most clinicians actually, like moving forward once you look at all the levels of oppression. And it's like, how can you not look at the trauma that a human is carrying and honoring where they've been and
Right.
where they are and where they're going?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I hope that this today has given some folks out there more information on diagnosing DID.
It has me. And just to be totally transparent, I mean, this is obviously not my specialty area. And so even that question of like, I'm wondering how it's affecting the brain, I'm noticing my own, like trying to not shame myself about how I ask that question, because it's hard to be like, I don't want to pathologize. And also I want to meet my client where they are. And so I just want to name my own sort of vulnerability there. And I wonder, if there's any other therapists out there that are feeling like that, feeling a little bit like, I'm nervous to even ask the question, or how, if I'm asking it in the right way, So if that's landing for anyone else, come to the webinar.
Well, I really love that you mentioned that, like, so vulnerably, because we really are in a society right now where if you're not actively, and I mean like somebody's champion for something, if you don't completely agree with them, then you're completely against them.
Mm,
And that is just not true. And also, it really shuts down any kind of new experiences that could happen or new learning or being challenged, right? Because then now a lot of people are paralyzed by fear of like, am I allowed
right.
to ask that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind
Like,
of, it can feel like that. It's like, I
yeah.
don't want to call it a brain injury. Oh, it's an adaptation. Okay. Like I can
Right.
feel good about learning that. And we can just notice like we might feel a little bit, hesitant maybe to like explore further. And really, I'm trying to open myself up to, there's so much to learn here. This isn't my specialty. It won't be my specialty, but I want to learn enough to be able to take the next steps and maybe refer out, or like you said, some of the resources that you've named.
I think that is, I really like that you bring that in because I'm thinking it has been called a brain injury by some researchers, is
Mm-hmm.
the truth.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's necessarily wrong. I just see it as the adaptation, right? That's my frame of reference, like how I view the world and perceive things. But truly, honestly, if you look up the PTSD, okay, this is not the DID research, but it goes into that a bit. PTSD, you have a certain ACEs scale. Like this is what the current research in the last 3 years is saying. Like, hey, if you have an ACEs score above this cutoff, right? Like I'm not going to give the cutoff here, see why. But above this cutoff, your life expectancy actually drops somewhere between like 14 and 24 years. 24 years of your life. Okay, well, maybe your genetics, you were going to live until 110. Now you're living to 90. Or you were living to 90. Now you're living like to 70.
Yeah.
So like when you
Mm-hmm.
look like what it's doing to the brain with DID, like there are some things that why I'm like focus on quality of life is because you can't undo it. What the research is now saying, I was talking about the HPA axis uptick essentially a little bit earlier. What all the research is saying is like, hey, it's like this and it's not going to shut off and we can't reverse it. And it's like, okay, hey, like let's take that. And okay, we can still have the quality of life that we want,
I
right?
love
Like
that.
you heard all the things that I'm doing. I have DID, but it matters if you're getting the right treatment or not. Had I had the wrong treatment, I wouldn't be here at all, is the truth. Like, period. You wouldn't even know, like my name. So essentially, I think it took me about 7 years, 6 or 7 years to be diagnosed. But the person who was treating me the whole time had the right treatment, the wrong diagnosis. So was getting
what you needed.
a lot of really good treatment, but like we just didn't know like what was going on, right? Like, so, and that's going to take time. And a lot of times it takes time to uncover a system, especially an implicit system. One time it took me 9 months to diagnose somebody with DID. 9 months. I mean, like I gave them so many assessments and like, you know, they're like 96, 97% accurate, but like that 3% is really hard to tack down then.
Yeah.
Anyways, but I think that like an injury, I think it's okay to say even, right? Like I don't feel offended at all.
But I like the framing that you're bringing of like, it's an adaptation. That to me feels like a better way of holding it in a very NARM-y kind of way. But, you know, this conversation, again, folks, if you're feeling curious, if you have more questions, that webinar is really going to be a fantastic resource. So NARM and Treating Dissociative Identity Disorder, Exploring Relationships Between Self, Parts, and NARM Therapist. So if you're listening to this podcast after that date, you can purchase this webinar on the NARM website. It will be available there if you're listening after the date of the webinar.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. And if any listeners have any like consultations they're thinking of or questions or want more resources, you can always email me, or if you go to the website, www.nccec.com, there we have a bunch of trauma clinicians, and also like my email, I think like is on there as well.
So cool. Thank you. I know there'll be some folks for sure that will want to find you and follow the work that you're doing. And thanks again for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM Therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.